Hello again and welcome to the kickoff of Solar Alberta's 2025 Solar Series. Today's session is called Indigenous Solar Leadership. We were delighted to have so many people register for this event. Please note that we will be recording the webinar for future distribution. My name is Heather McKenzie and I'm the Executive Director of Solar Alberta. I just want to take a minute to acknowledge that I'm hosting you today and working day to day from Amiskwaciy-Waskahegan, also known as Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homelands of the Métis Nation. Treaty 6 territory is the traditional gathering place and home of many Indigenous peoples, including the Papaches, Nehiyawak or Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Blackfoot, and Nakota Sioux, nations whose ancestors have cared for and nurtured these lands since time immemorial. Today, we're going to be hearing from Executive Director of Indigenous Clean Energy, James Jenkins. Following his presentation, there will be a question and answer period in which you can all participate. The entire session will wrap up in an hour and a half. Please note that we have enabled closed captioning for this presentation, so you can turn the captioning on in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. During the Q&A period, we're going to be using Zoom Q&A for questions rather than the chat box. So please enter your questions in the Q&A section. Also, please click on the little thumbs up symbols to upvote questions that you like. And before we move forward, we're actually going to do a quick poll just to get a sense of who we have joining us today. So please take a minute to answer the question that should be popping up on your screen shortly. There it is. Get a little sense of who's all here. And while some are still doing the poll, just want to encourage you to take a minute, please pop your name, land acknowledgement, any contact info that you're comfortable sharing in the chat now and throughout the event so that others can look you up on LinkedIn or email you, and hopefully we can form some new relationships. Okay, just gonna see where that poll lands. We're getting a good number of folks out. Okay. Wow, a nice split. So we've got a fair number of solar curious here. We added this new solar enthusiast category because we know there's a lot of micro generators and super keeners among you, and then lots of industry folks out. So appreciate you all joining us today. Nice to have a breadth in the audience. Now just a little about Solar Alberta before we get going. This is actually our 34th year of operation. Albertans have been really excited about solar for quite a while. We're a nonprofit society that is dedicated to accelerating Alberta's transition to a just and sustainable energy future. We do so by advocating, educating, and serving as an industry hub and community hub for solar energy. Our membership is made up of over 240 individuals, over 160 businesses, and we also have over 30,000 followers these days. So lots of folks in the mix. We provide a number of services, including managing a solar directory through our website. In this way, we act as a bridge for installers, suppliers, and other solar-related businesses to contact their customers and clients or connect with them. Our directory gets over 48,000 hits each year. You can see a screenshot of the directory here on this slide, and there's a link to it in the chat. You can filter our directory based on the services provided by our members, the region of the province or country where our members operate, and according to the various commitments and certifications that our members have made. So if you're interested in an Indigenous-owned business, you can actually also filter for that on our directory. Also, our 2025 Solar Show is coming up quickly here between February 3rd and 7th. It's going to feature engaging free content for the general public, as well as informative, free, and affordable solar industry-oriented sessions. These will all be online. We'll have speakers and info tailored to a wide variety of audiences, including the general public, farmers, manufacturers, green builders, and solar industry professionals. So don't miss out on this opportunity to be a part of the Solar Show and connect with folks just like you. You can use the link in the chat to register. Recordings of all of our previous Solar Show sessions and seminars, well, those that were recorded, I guess we've got about 5 years there now, can be found on our Solar Alberta YouTube channel. Please sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media to find out all about our upcoming events. We're once again offering affordable courses for solar industry professionals or those transitioning into the sector. Most of our courses are online Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Next up is Solar PV Systems, Design and Modeling. Starts Tuesday, February 11th. And on the first weekend of April, we're offering an in-person course in Calgary, Solar PV Systems, Commissioning, Operations, and Maintenance. We're also once again offering a solar training course bundle. So that's a discounted bundle if you want to take our 3 online technical courses that are coming up. The link to purchase the bundle and all of our courses individually is going in the chat. And on-demand recordings of all of our courses and workshops are available on the solar training videos section of our website. In addition to providing education about solar, we also advocate for it. So we're currently rising up for renewables, and we have free lawn signs available for pickup in 10 municipalities. We do offer free delivery in 8 of those municipalities around Alberta as well. And we have template letters that you can use from our website asking the government of Alberta to eliminate the new and discriminatory buffer zones that they have established for renewable energy. Your support with our advocacy efforts is super important, so click on the link in the chat, make a free sign order today, or check out our templates. And finally, we ask that you please consider participating in our 50/50 raffle, which is now over $1,600. So ticket sales will end on February 7th, and you can find the link for that in the chat. If you're not already, just want to encourage you to join us as a member. We're constantly evolving our member service offerings, some of which include discounts on our courses, workshops. We've got members only emails, all sorts of fun stuff like that. So individual membership is just $35 and can be purchased at the link in the chat. And if you want to support our work, you could also please consider volunteering or donating. The link for both is going in the chat now. Now, without further ado, just want to take this opportunity to give a big shout out to Red Deer Polytechnic for sponsoring this session in particular. We couldn't offer all of our amazing free content without the support of our sponsors. We're always interested in developing more partnerships for our events, and we do have 1 solar show sponsorship left. So if your organization wants to work with us to educate the public about solar or solar related technologies, don't hesitate to reach out. Now, I'd like to introduce our sponsor for the session, Alicia Cafferata from Red Deer Polytechnic. Alicia will tell us a little bit about Red Deer Polytechnic and introduce our presenter for the day. So welcome, Alicia, and thank you very much for your support. I'm going to have you turn your camera on. You're right there. Well done. Thanks so much. And I'll turn the mic over to you now.
It is my pleasure to be here as a representative of Red Deer Polytechnic. We are proud to be a sponsor of this event, which recognizes and celebrates Indigenous solar leadership. Innovation is the cornerstone of progress and the driving force behind our ability to shape a brighter and more prosperous future for our students, our community, and our province. Over the last 2 decades, RDP has taken progressively greater steps to improve energy conservation, reduce our energy costs, and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. This includes the installation of nearly 4,200 solar panels across campus. Our Energy Innovation Center analyzes the data gathered from these panels to compare actual output to theoretical output, creating the foundation needed to optimize solar energy in Alberta. But sustainability is inseparable from reconciliation. At RDP, we believe in education as reconciliation through action. We strive to be a reliable partner in decolonization, and we're proud to support initiatives that advance both sustainability and reconciliation. Today, we are happy to celebrate Indigenous leadership in sustainable energy and to learn from someone who has inspired us with their groundbreaking innovative work. I am really happy to introduce James Jenkins. James is the Executive Director of Indigenous Clean Energy. He is a member of Walpole Island First Nations, where he has previously served as CEO. James is a former municipal clerk and founded the Indigenous advisory service firm, Ajajak Solutions. And this is my favorite part. He is a proud father of 3 and a multi-instrumentalist and an avid outdoorsman. So I will now turn the mic over to James.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for that introduction. And thank you, Heather, for having me here into Solar Alberta. And just want to welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I'm calling from southwestern Ontario. I'm from Walpole Island First Nation, so I'm calling from the territory. And that map behind me is of Lake St. Clair. Walpole Island First Nation is located in the lake. It's about 91 square miles, directly on the US-Canada border. So let's share my screen. So as Alicia mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Indigenous Clean Energy. I've been with the organization for about 2 years. And I'm going to be talking a bit about the work that we've been doing and about Indigenous leadership in the energy transition here in Canada. Let's see here. So Indigenous Clean Energy, or ICE, we're a not-for-profit organization. We were founded about 10 years ago, and our core mandate is to promote Indigenous participation in the energy transition and in electrification through capacity building, leadership development, and a number of training programs. And we are present in every province in Canada, all of the territories, and we're supporting projects really in every region in Canada, First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. So this diagram shows a little bit about the areas that we're involved in. Our work is supported about 50-50 government grants and partnerships we have with the federal government and provinces, as well as philanthropic funding. And we really do see our work this way. Sometimes the funding streams are much more linear than this, but when we're very much involved in the community side of work, ensuring that we're building capacity and that we're present in the community. And so we see these various aspects of the energy transition really feeding into each other at the community level. So on the left-hand side, we're supporting new generation projects through renewable energy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that includes the various kinds of generation, including solar. And then on the top, energy efficiency and conservation tend to be a very important part of our work as well, especially when we're supporting projects at the community level, where unsustainable housing and buildings tend to be at the forefront of need. And so we try to work with communities that are weaving these aspects together. We're also, on the right-hand side, advanced energy systems. We're learning quite a bit about smart grids, and there's more interest from Indigenous communities in emerging technologies, and there's more participation in energy storage, electric heating and cooling, clean fuels. So this is becoming a much bigger part of the landscape. And finally, on the bottom part, we're seeing more Indigenous participation in transmission projects. Many provinces have, they've started creating a requirement for Indigenous equity in new transmission projects being led by Ontario, but we're involved in a number of aspects of infrastructure, including district energy projects, hydrogen, and electric vehicles. And you can see on the outer circle, our partnerships are fairly wide, and so we're really working with a number of partners, including closely with the utilities, who are very much in the driver's seat with the transmission now, and more and more through companies, federal, provincial agencies, and community and local government. So just more broadly in the work we're doing, there's been quite a bit of interest in these kinds of projects that we've been supporting over the last 10 years. And some of that on the left-hand side, we're seeing some desire at the community level to be involved in projects that do have an impact on emissions. And so you see a number of ways. Some of our partnerships with the federal government have included the Indigenous Off-Diesel Initiative, that's been it's been running for about 6 years now with 2 different cohorts, and it includes a larger grant component and capacity building. And it really emerged both from the need within community and the desire to do something about emissions and the high cost of diesel in remote communities, and to translate some of these technologies into action at the community level. And then on the right-hand side are a number of opportunities that come about with communities that are involved in the clean energy transition, including a revenue stream for communities, more economic development opportunities, jobs, investment in clean energy, skills development, and catalyzing leadership in energy. And we're seeing that at a number of different tables, not just energy tables, but at the national Indigenous organizations like Assembly of First Nations and Métis National Council, that energy and the clean energy transition is really increasingly on the agenda. So I want to talk a little bit about how the landscape is changing for Indigenous participation. So Indigenous communities and businesses have been very active in solar, biomass, and hydro over the past couple decades. What these three graphs show are the split of projects by generation type. And these are for projects 1 megawatt or more. So, going back to 2000, you saw the emergence of more community scale projects, so under 1 megawatt. And we're seeing the number of projects over 1 megawatt increase, including some that are hundreds of megawatts or more. And you can see the Indigenous economic participation in those medium to larger projects was all hydro 25 years ago. And by 2010, there were a number of large wind projects with ownership by Indigenous communities. And then more recently, there's much more diversification with bioenergy and solar taking up significant portions of that pie, and really overtaking hydro projects in terms of the number of large projects that have that Indigenous participation component. And some of those recent projects also include energy storage and batteries, housing efficiency, and some of the more advanced technologies. So we're seeing a year-over-year increase in the number of communities that are involved, and this graph is showing where the projects are located with Indigenous participation that are over 1 megawatt again. So you can see the majority are in British Columbia, followed by Ontario. Alberta is not too far behind, and has it definitely saw a large increase in the number of medium to large projects over the last decade or so, partly due to the deregulated landscape, the ability to enter into PPAs in a more streamlined way than most jurisdictions, whereas the majority of these other jurisdictions, including BC, Ontario, and Quebec, were driven more by procurement by the utilities. So the kinds of ownership agreements are diversifying. What we saw back in 2000, when most of the large partnerships with hydro projects, was that when there was a large project that was going to have an impact on the territory of an Indigenous community, the most common outcome was what's called an impact benefit agreement, or IBA, which would be a confidential document between the developer and the impacted Indigenous body. And this was really driven by Supreme Court decisions, a legal theory that was created by the Supreme Court called the duty to consult and accommodate. So these confidential agreements, IBAs, were meant to offset the impacts of these larger landscape scale projects. And they became very common all throughout Canada. But what we've seen more recently is that partnerships and equity are becoming a much more common standard. Indigenous communities are asking for them, and they have a number of benefits as well in terms of harnessing Indigenous partners and their expertise through project review and other means as an asset and a partner at the table. But they become much more common, and some of the utilities, some of those other jurisdictions, they're requiring them now. So you see that in BC's recent call to power. It is becoming more common, and IBAs are not necessarily the gold standard for some of these larger projects. So the scale has been generally increasing and projects are becoming more diverse. I mentioned these two projects here. Meadow Lake Bioenergy is in northern Saskatchewan. It's about 12 megawatts. And what's unique about it, it's one of the first medium scale projects. They sell directly to an agricultural consumer, and it's 100% owned by the Meadow Lake Tribal Council, made up of the First Nations that form that tribal council. And so it was very much a larger scale homegrown solution. Prior to that, forestry residue had been it had been dealt with through a beehive mechanism that's a very high emissions contributor and didn't provide any economic benefit. So they moved forward on this project. A number of champions that went through our programs helped move this project through completion. So they're providing about 12 megawatts to industry. And the Oneida Battery Storage Project is located in southern Ontario, and it's a 50% partnership with Six Nations Development Corporation and NR-Store. And again, it's another homegrown solution. It wasn't triggered by any procurement or any request from utilities or government. It really was a matter of the Indigenous Development Corporation sitting down and deciding what can we do with our assets and approaching provincial government with a proposal. So this will provide grid stability to Southern Ontario, and it's very much Indigenous-led. And of course, we're seeing more diversification into housing and advanced technologies, and also an importance in the mineral sector, which is a high employer for Indigenous communities and tends to be located in Indigenous territories. So the increased Indigenous participation in clean energy has other benefits for communities. We were conservatively estimating 2 years ago $350 to $400 million in annual net revenue for these communities that is reinvested in economic development and social programs. I'll talk a bit more about it, but we're seeing a steady increase in these medium to large projects, so that figure would be increasing as well. So this kind of economic participation has a larger net benefit and is reinvested at the community scale. So we're seeing a number of trends across Canada. One is the trend of electrification and growing demand. So every province and territory is predicting at least 2% compounded electricity growth over the next 20 years. Conservatively, in some cases as much as 3%. So they're all moving very quickly to put plans in place and to create an environment where they can bring new energy generation to the market quickly to meet this growing demand. And many of them are also, they're promoting Indigenous participation as well. So not just central Canada and BC, it's very common in the Atlantic provinces and other places where you see less deregulation as well. And that demand growth, we're proposing through our programming, getting back to the first slide of how important conservation and demand side efficiency is for our programming. We're really pushing for a larger investment in that, and we're building up our programs to prepare for more Indigenous participation on demand side as well as new technologies like hydrogen. And so with the growth of Indigenous participation in these larger projects, Indigenous communities have become the second largest collective owner of clean energy assets in Canada after utilities. And so collectively, Indigenous leadership has become essential to meet these energy requirements. So we've been tracking the growth in these medium to large projects, smaller ones as well, but as far as projects with more than 1 megawatt, we've been seeing a 32% growth rate year over year since 2020. And on average, over the last 5 years, we saw almost 50% average equity in these projects. So we're seeing a high level of Indigenous investment in projects with a very rapid growth rate. And I mentioned a bit about the economic benefit to communities. There are also some academic studies coming out that are showing that there's higher well-being in Indigenous communities that hold majority stakes in some of these renewable energy projects. And so some recent studies have shown that that those communities are showing well-being, that the two are connected. And we see that particularly with solar and wind, not necessarily with hydropower. And there's probably multiple reasons for that. Many of the hydropower partnerships have been triggered by refurbishments and other more recent changes, but in most cases we're talking about projects that are relatively old compared to the solar and wind infrastructure with Indigenous participation. But we may see that changing with the Indigenous tax credit. There will probably be more reinvestment in hydro, including refurbishment, possibly replacement of infrastructure, and likely more Indigenous participation as well. So it remains to be seen what those partnerships will look like. And at the time of writing the slideshow, we were still tracking 40 very large projects that were announced that haven't reached completion yet. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we do at Indigenous Clean Energy to support Indigenous participation. These two photos are of our 2020 Catalyst program, which I'll talk a bit more about from 2023. So a number of Indigenous leaders in clean energy that took our 3-week intensive from across the country. And one of our offerings is the ICE network. So this is an open source web-based platform that anybody listening today can sign up. It functions a bit like a social media site or a job board. And the way that it functions is anybody can sign up and post opportunities. So if you are looking for a particular Indigenous business or expert for whatever reason, it is a place you can go and post an opportunity or a question. And so I definitely encourage you to make use of the ICE network, and it's linked to our website at indigenouscleanenergy.com. The majority of our programming is on-site intensives. So our 2020 Catalyst program was our premier program that we started in 2016, and we've run it every year other than a break during the pandemic when on-site intensives became difficult. But the way we structure that program is 3 separate weeks. We space them throughout the year now, where Indigenous Clean Energy leaders are exposed to all aspects of project completion and are exposed to experts and mentors that can make them ready to lead projects to success. And we've also grown in our programming, especially in the last 3 to 4 years, to include a youth component and advocacy components. So some of the emerging priorities are we are pushing for the rapid development of a newer fund that can help tackle the larger problem that we have when it comes to Indigenous housing and Indigenous buildings, which tend to be very inefficient. So we have some reports that are published on our website where we've surveyed the extent of Indigenous housing, where the numbers of houses needing major repairs far outpace non-Indigenous communities. And what that means is, in terms of electrification and meeting energy demand, there is a very high return on investment in dealing with some of these unsustainable buildings in Indigenous communities. And they have other positive outcomes as well, including health outcomes, and we've linked those in a number of reports. But it will be a relatively expensive endeavor in terms of tackling this program nationwide. So we are promoting a blended finance model, and we're working with a number of government agencies and private companies to explore what a model could look like that would function to tackle that problem. And I'll be talking a bit about our programs, but capacity building is also very important to ensure that we have experts in community and leadership and as well as skills training for diverse workforce coming from Indigenous communities as we see participation increasing. It really is, as I'm sure many of you experience in the solar sector in general, a relative struggle to ensure that there is enough talent to meet demand and to lead projects to success. So we've seen with our earlier cohorts through our programs, many of those alumni have gone on to lead successful businesses and gone on to hire hundreds of Indigenous leaders in this sector. But there really is that need to continue training and ensure that there is a new generation of leaders that can continue this work. So diving a bit deeper into what our programs consist of. So in terms of Indigenous clean energy leadership, we ensure that knowledge about project planning, management. We have community energy planning component, which we've seen is very important to the success of a community, getting the entire community involved, making sure that there is that buy-in and that literacy. Being able to work effectively with partners, both from government, the private sector, and elsewhere, having that understanding of energy, finances. We provide collaboration and networking opportunities that wouldn't necessarily be present for the Indigenous workforce, and it's had a large impact. It's definitely an area of economic development in Canada that doesn't have very many parallels in terms of having the economic outputs it has right now, and we've really worked to sustain that network of leaders. We've moved in terms of our training for an understanding of equity agreements and participation in these larger projects, as well as the steps to ensure that the community is involved in that process. As well as an understanding of the UN rights of Indigenous peoples as it's being implemented by the Government of Canada, and gender equity, accessibility, and ensuring that there is participation across generations, which tends to be a value in many Indigenous communities in Canada. So I'll quickly give a summary of the programs. I talked a bit about the 2020 Catalyst program. It's been running since 2016, and it really is a premier program meant to train Indigenous leaders. Some of them are coming from other sectors, like finance, for example, engineering, and they're interested in getting into the sector. So we do have a mix of mid-career. We have more youth in this program now than when we started, I think, as communities start to see the opportunities in the energy transition. And I just want to mention our applications for the cohort for this year are closing in January 31st. I know that's soon, but if you do know somebody that might be a good fit, if they're working in an Indigenous community or business, they're eligible, and we're closing on January 31st. Just quickly want to highlight Austin from Métis Nation of Alberta, who's been through several of our programs. We've had a number of Alberta Catalysts and other members of programs, but he's gone on to lead a number of projects with Indigenous participation in Alberta. He's now a member of our advisory council. We have a program as well called Mentorship and Resources. So we've collected learnings from across our programs to be able to support our alumni and have wraparound supports for people in our programs as well as a mentorship program that I think goes a bit deeper than traditional mentorship programs, because we really pair the mentors up with needs, and sometimes that includes technical needs, financing needs. It can be a number of different areas to really support live projects. And we also have some smaller offerings through this program, including technical service grants, education kits, and a number of ways to support projects on the ground. One of our more recent programs is our National Hub, which is part of our energy and climate team. And we're supporting the national and regional Indigenous organizations and have partnerships with all of the national Indigenous organizations. We're also supporting different federal agencies and have active tables with Natural Resources Canada, CMHC, Environment Canada, and ISC. We complete research and advocacy on a just transition, so that means participation by Indigenous communities in a fair way. And just some highlights of some of the work we've been doing with much more action at the provincial level, given the emerging energy demand. We supported BC Hydro on the call to power, which included a minimum threshold and Indigenous rate adder, as well as held a webinar series to support Indigenous communities interested in participating in that procurement. And more recently, we're working with the Manitoba Premier's office on their energy planning, and we have formal partnerships in Ontario with utilities, including Hydro One and IESO. Our global hub is the other aspect of our energy and climate team, and we have worked to establish growing networks between Indigenous communities in Canada and kin in other parts of the world. And we have active relationships in Oceania and South America, Australia, New Zealand, Colombia, and Ecuador. And these function as a learning exchange. In Oceania, we have sister organizations and a train-the-trainer model, and we have similar activities in South America as well. And through participating in UN forums and other opportunities and having a global component at our ICE network and ICE gathering, we've really expanded our reach in this area. I'll talk a bit about our youth programs. Generation Power it's a wage subsidy program, but it also provides wraparound supports to really give Indigenous youth workers a leg up in their participation in employment opportunities. So if you have a business, we can support a wage subsidy for an Indigenous youth. So that means somebody up to age 30. And if it's in the clean energy sector, your business is probably eligible. So I would definitely consider that opportunity as an employer. Or if you're Indigenous and under the age of 30, we can pair you with an employer. Our Imagination program is our other large youth program, and it includes a capacity building program that has an on-site component. And it's built around launching a clean energy project. And so we provide a grant component and wraparound support. You can visit the website for Imagination to see a list of inspiring projects that our youth have been leading. And just to talk a little bit about some of the earlier projects that have been the inspiration for our involvement in clean energy. We were involved in a solar tiny home project in Bella Coola, where 5 net zero tiny homes were built to deal with homeless men that were experiencing homelessness that wanted to return to the community. So that was built and works as one of the, it helps us build a community of practice. Bella Coola is a remote off-grid community, and it's used this experience to feed into a number of innovative solar projects throughout their housing, including triplexes and single-family homes. The Hope Garden Greenhouse it's a Saskatchewan project at Montreal Lake Cree Nation that provides solar heat for food crops all year, and that can sell energy back into the grid. And we see quite a few of our Imagination projects following along similar models. So we have a project that's led by Red River Métis in Manitoba, as well as some other First Nation communities led by youth that want to create demonstration greenhouses and highlight food sovereignty, but using sustainable and solar energy. And then Montana First Nation is another example. It was a 20 kilowatt solar on waste treatment plant where we provided hands-on solar training for youth, and it was very expansive in Alberta. And Montana First Nation went on to build the largest on-reserve solar facility at the time that was located in the community that sells energy back into the grid. I realize I'm getting short on time, so I'll speed up just a bit. We have a capital grant program to support EV chargers, and eligible organizations include Indigenous communities and businesses. And our final suite of programs that we've really been building up is called Bringing It Home, where we're focusing on demand side. And so we also have on-site intensives for our Bringing It Home communities. And this is from our first cohort. Our second cohort will be starting soon. So in addition to 2 weeks of on-site intensives, we also provide a large grant so that they can start their project. And Fishing Lake Métis Settlement is one community that's received support, has had quite a bit of success on net zero community-based housing, and Leon and some of their members act as advisors for our community. So they've been ahead of the pack as a community in implementing energy efficiency solutions. So this is our Project Accelerator program. It's that 2-week intensive and a grant of $125,000 per community. And we are working closely with government so that we can ensure that the work we're doing is scalable, but really we're trying to catalyze this kind of work in the same way we did generation projects. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James. And just a reminder for everybody in attendance to please put your questions in the Q&A box that is separate from the chat box in your Zoom toolbar, and I'll pull from those there. While folks put some questions in the chat, I have a couple questions here from internally generated. Alicia, our sponsor, was actually wondering if Indigenous communities that ICE is working with are also facing some of the pressure that we're seeing with respect to wind and solar developments on agricultural land. Is there some challenge there as well? I know in Alberta, this has been a concern that it's almost like a red herring. Like we actually only need 0.08% of Alberta's agricultural land to have a net zero grid, I believe. But regardless, regardless of that, the province has been kind of trying to drive a wedge there between agricultural communities and renewable folks. So just curious if you've seen that type of pushback across the country and how that's going.
Alberta, it certainly had an impact because Indigenous-led projects was trending upward very quickly until the moratorium, and we've definitely seen that slow down. So that's something we've observed. I think we were hoping for a more forward-looking energy plan, and we're still hopeful, but I think we've been waiting. We haven't seen that kind of uptake that we were seeing pre-moratorium. I mean, in terms of that question, Ontario is another place where they've actually released procurement for a large amount of wind and solar in the near future through their planning utility ISO. And agriculture will be an issue. I'm not sure in Ontario I would characterize it in quite the same way. I think the challenge there will be moving forward on Class A agricultural land for those kinds of landscape scale projects is very difficult or impossible in many cases. I think the real challenge will be the local communities don't have the same kind of capacity they have to move through project review that they did when a previous piece of legislation called the Green Energy Act was in place, when you saw many solar and wind projects moving along. So so that's a factor, absolutely. Is it driving a wedge in the same way? I would say no, not yet. It definitely is a risk, though.
Yeah, on that note, I noticed when the moratorium was implemented here in Alberta on wind and solar projects, I think there was some serious misunderstanding taking place, because when they put the buffer zones in place, the province said, "Oh, but this won't affect First Nations because they're not included." Well, little did they know, a lot of the nations in Alberta are building solar on non-nation land. They're not necessarily only doing their solar farms within the nation. Some have, and that's neat, but others have started within the nation and then started to invest more broadly around the province. And so yes, their developments were it's interesting to hear that they were and have slowed down, and I'm not surprised given how folks were diversifying their portfolio and going out beyond their own little, invented borders, right? So it was a shame to see that, and the buffer zones are still there, and so we're still advocating on that. But thank you. It's good to get the broader context as well, and to know that this is fairly Alberta specific right now. Andrea has a question for you here, which is, what is the best direction to take with building net zero homes? Is there training we could take to know more about net zero homes? I will just start us off with a comment there, Andrea. Solar Alberta does have quite a few workshops on our website. And so a number of them are about net zero homes. One of our solar show workshops will be about deep energy retrofits. And those are all available they're about $40 a pop, but we do have a diversity discount code. So if anyone who is Indigenous would like that code and they'd like 20% off, they can send us an email. We'll fire them the code. So we do have some resources that way. There's also Retrofit Canada that really supports net zero home building. Anything you wanted to add there though, James? I know this question is for you.
Certainly we have our project accelerator now for Indigenous communities and businesses that are interested in net zero home projects. And we're seeing a number of Indigenous leaders in that area. Sutina, Alberta is one, and some communities that are utilizing settlement dollars to build net zero communities. So that's becoming more common in southern BC and southern Ontario. We're seeing some examples of that. So we are trying to facilitate a more community of practice. And in terms of just getting into it, yeah, I think there's a little bit of a mismatch between those communities that are using our own source revenue or another revenue stream to just really move ahead with very ambitious net zero projects, and then other communities that are trying their best to stitch together different revenue streams to have an impact. But definitely, I would encourage you to follow us on the ICE network and take advantage of our events through bringing it home.
No, thanks for that, James. I am glad you brought up housing today, because I know there's a lot of traction and movement on the solar farms, but we are all worried about the housing component, because how do you put solar on a house that doesn't have a roof that supports 3 pounds per square foot? You don't, right? So the retrofits are not only nice to reduce energy consumption and whatnot on the whole, and comfort, but also you just literally can't have solar on many of those homes because the roofs are just not good enough quality. And then also the electrical infrastructure is often not adequate to have the solar. So I really appreciate your holistic perspective on that, because I don't know if everybody realizes how the housing compromises the ability to adopt solar in many instances on the smaller scale, where you're not talking about the large solar farms.
Well, it has been interesting how the federal government has invested fairly heavily in Indigenous clean generation over the last 10 years, and it has had an impact. I think it's been part of the push where we see this kind of participation, but there hasn't been enough in projects like deep energy retrofits, demand side, where at the community level, I think all of our champions are seeing it's hard to move forward on a project without taking that into account. And sometimes they're moving forward anyway, but we are really trying to change that understanding at the higher level and through the federal grant process. And we see provinces starting to acknowledge that now. Ontario just had a very ambitious demand side announcement, but we have to have a larger shift towards that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Really nice question here. What are the biggest opportunities for Indigenous peoples in the energy just transition? And I think you mentioned quite a few, but when you're sort of, when you're thinking big, where do you see the biggest opportunities, and out of all the different things you're working on, the greatest potential for a just transition there with Indigenous involvement?
Definitely some of the grid connected opportunities, including participation in grid infrastructure itself, is an emerging opportunity for communities that are on the grid, particularly those near, major consumers of electricity, like metropolitan areas, industry, certain agriculture. Um, it's easy to think of it as a dichotomy. It's really not. We also have smaller communities that are off the grid, or their grid capacity is relatively low. They're far from those major consuming centers. There are still many opportunities for them to lead projects, and that really starts at community energy planning.
Mhm.
Um, and and I think more broadly, so there have been many off-grid projects that have taken place in Indigenous communities over the last 10 years. Where we see a major opportunity is to learn from what has been the experience of those projects, because we've learned quite a bit when it comes to technology, but also governance of a project, governance of the relationship with the utility, and there's been quite a bit of learning that's come out of that, and it's been across a very vast part of Canada in terms of places that aren't serviced by the grid. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of bringing that learning together and putting together the tools for a very successful community scale project. And I think there's quite a bit of learning when it comes to smart grids.
Mm.
With electrification, that's going to be an important, I think, part of the grid at large. So there's an untapped opportunity for communities. How do we become part of that conversation, even if they're not on the larger grid? But we have seen these smaller community scale projects. Often they help create the kind of capacity where after a relatively modest project like rooftop solar and that sort of thing, it can lead to having the kind of energy literacy and capacity to move into these larger grid scale projects.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about the transmission component. And I know I was learning about the system in Texas. Dr. Sarah Hastings Simons was here with us a year ago today telling us that in Texas they build transmission lines and then they will come, is the idea. The solar will
Mm,
come. And so why not build encourage the provinces and the feds to build the transmission lines to the nations so that then either indigenous nations or partnerships can form and farms can be built there, where it can benefit a lot of folks. So anyways, lots of innovation around the transmission piece, and I'm glad you're at the forefront of that, because I agree. It's just it's going to become so important too, as we increasingly see all this tension around the world, all this tension with different countries and things. How can we build up our resilience here in Canada and across the different borders internally, so that we can actually have some energy independence, right? And so anyways,
mhm.
need to hear. Chris is here. Thanks for being here, Chris. Curious if there is a map slash directory of Indigenous energy projects. I was going to ask the same question. I thought I would love it if there was a map. And is there a remote communities fossil fuel independence focus in addition to more traditional grid tied solar projects? So I think those are kind of two questions there. Maybe you could touch on the map one first, because that's where we're all kind of curious.
Sure. We did have a map on our website for a number of years, and it was well cited. I would see it in presentations all over the place. And so one of the things we decided to do recently was take it down from the website. The main reason being it was more of a technical reason, but it wasn't as updated as it could be. So I think the map did help in terms of people are often surprised to see how many projects they are, how widespread they are, how there's probably one near you. But we're looking at bringing that map back online. We're still tracking the data and have up-to-date data in terms of Indigenous projects across the country. It's just what will that look like on the website, because we do see the value of that for sure, and it does even have that initial value of seeing, well, the scale is rather large, and Indigenous communities have become major players in the energy sector.
Yeah, and actually that might be something we could collaborate on too, because we do have a map of installations near you, is what it's called
Mm,
on our website, and we could potentially just throw your installations on our map and make sure it's really clear what they are, so they're different
okay,
from the others. So, anyways, we could
interesting.
maybe we could collaborate on that, and you don't have to do all the work on the mapping front. But let's talk shop about that later. But yeah, no, it's
Mm,
great to hear what's going on, and you're right, a lot of people aren't aware of what might be happening right
yeah.
around them. So. So Chris's second question that I mentioned earlier, but I'll repeat because I think it was separate from the first one. Is there a remote communities fossil fuel independence focus in addition to more traditional grid-tied solar projects? I did hear you talk about off-grid. That was intriguing to me because I think the stat I heard was that only like 1% of Alberta's solar is off-grid. So
Mm.
I suspect that might look different with Indigenous nations, and especially given their remote nature. Would you say the percentage of off-grid and sort of independent projects is higher than 1% in the communities that you're working with?
It definitely is, and there are some. So we do have the more longer term stream of program support, and we partnered with NRCan for almost 7 years now on supporting off-grid communities. But what we do is we have the champions from those communities attend the same training as our more mainstream applicants. So they're being exposed to the same kinds of learnings as communities that are on the grid for the most part, but they have a lot of boutique support that the off-grid projects don't necessarily have. There are some in Alberta, in Fort Chipewyan. There are several, and they've done some work in terms of off-grid on the front of the Rocky Mountains as well. There are some off-grid communities that are receiving support. Some of them are still at the project initiation phase.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the conversations we frequently have is really that you only really want to be off grid if you have to be, because you miss out on a lot of potential income generating if you are. So
Mm,
so you don't necessarily, in Alberta, you don't necessarily want to gun for that unless you really don't want to make all that money off the grid. So, but there are so many remote communities where it's not even optional. Like you mentioned, Fort Chip, yeah, their whole grid is a microgrid. They don't have the option of being grid connected, so to speak. So I'm glad you brought them up. We do actually have a webinar if anyone's on our YouTube channel. We actually have Calvin from Fort Chip did a really wonderful presentation for us, I think two Januaries ago in our seminar series about some of their solar initiatives, and both locally as well as how they're considering investing elsewhere. So that was inspiring. And I actually got his name off your website because he was
oh,
one of your catalysts, and I said, "Oh, we need an Alberta catalyst." So,
oh, good.
oh yeah, it was
Very
lovely.
good.
So, Dave here is wondering, okay, there has been no reference to solar LED interior or exterior lighting. Several Canadian companies have developed completely DC voltage lighting systems. Will this become a priority? So I guess, does lighting fit into your work at all? How do you see that in the picture?
Hmm. We do have, yes, some of our recent catalysts are very much focused on solar LED lighting as an initial stage, I'll call it a quick start in their community energy plan. So some of them have already completed projects for streetlights and other infrastructure. So there is some interest in that, and yeah, the nice thing about it is I think some communities have seized on it as being more achievable in the shorter term. So it's a good win. I mean, still a challenging project in many cases, but we are hearing that from some of our participants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, of course, lighting will be part of the deep energy retrofits for sure, because I know it's kind of all everything's in usually when you're chatting about that sort
Mm,
of thing. I will say that Dave also helpfully did put in the chat when I was chatting about the limitations of crappy roofs. He said there are some technologies
mm,
that can support solar for roofs that aren't very good, and so it is important to know that technology is always changing on the lighting front, the solar front. It is good to stay aware of these things. I guess one of the challenges is sometimes those new technologies can be kind of hard to pay for. And so
mm.
I
That's
know,
true.
so solar integrated, like people are saying, oh, well, let's just throw some solar integrated siding on and whatnot. I'm like, great.
Hmm.
Not super affordable yet, but that will be awesome someday when we can just throw solar into every single component of our
Right.
build. I definitely look forward to the day. And we do have members who are moving and shaking on that front too. So, so good to talk about the tech side of things, and nice to hear that your catalysts are kind of looking at those whole systems. Brent has a question here. Is there still funding for the Charge Up program? If so, who should we contact at ICE for this?
There is funding for the Charge Up program. It's going to extend for another 9 months or so. So, we are looking for relatively project-ready projects, but definitely reach out. Our program manager is Jessica Tate for ChargeUp, but you can reach out to me or her directly, or if you email us at info@indigenouscleanenergy.com, we'll get you to the right place.
I suspect I've been the beneficiary of your program because I frequently travel through North Battleford, and and the last time I was going through, I usually hit this one fast charger at the Canadian Tire, but across the street was an even faster one.
Mm. Oh, very good.
That was run by the local nation there, and I thought, oh, this is great, and so I got to Saskatoon in record time. So
Oh,
so if that was your program, thank you very much.
fantastic. That's good to
North,
hear.
yeah, well, in North Battleford really needed a second option, like
Mm.
if the first one's taken, what are you going to do, right? So you
Hmm.
have to wait quite a while. So it was really nice to see so many of the First Nations starting to roll out that infrastructure for the benefit of all, and
Hmm.
I really appreciate that. Brent has a question here. Is there any Indigenous community funding for smaller solar projects, less than 1 megawatt? For example, solar projects for individual homes. So um, individual home type retrofit or solar rebate type thing. It sounds like he's looking for.
Mm-hmm. Um, Yeah, there certainly is. I mean, I would look if it's for Indigenous community funding, I would look at what federal programs are available. There may be programs through the provincial utility. It really just it depends. So they come and go. And but yeah, they're definitely still available. Yeah.
Yeah, I know one of the issues that I wouldn't mind you speaking to is the issue of home ownership, because I remember the Canada Greener Homes Grant and the Canada Greener Homes Loan are only available to Canadians who own their own home. And I was thinking about that in the context of First Nations, and so many First Nations, the homes are often owned by the community, if I'm not mistaken, and not necessarily by the individual. Has that been causing some issues for nations that they have a different ownership structure than you might find elsewhere?
That's definitely a factor that makes how larger scale housing solutions more challenging, and that's because home ownership models in Indigenous communities have quite a bit of diversity. So you have some that may, appear very familiar in terms of home ownership models in downtown Edmonton or Edmonton or Calgary, and then there are others where homes are owned by the band, some are communally owned, some are treated as rental stock, and then there are several different widely used home ownership models that are meant to facilitate mortgages and traditional home ownership financing, which has its own barriers on reserve. So that's
Mhm.
really led to it's definitely not insurmountable, but I think it's been enough for some efforts that for the leaders to throw up their hands and say, well, how can we do this? Because one size doesn't always fit all. And greener homes would be an example of that in terms of it's not going to look the same for every community, and simply bumping up housing budgets in every community may not have the impact that a program like that wants. So yeah, it can be a bit complex.
Mhm.
Like my own community has a homegrown loan homeowner loan model where most homes are owned by a homeowner. Uh, and the loan is through the First Nation itself. But then there are other models where there's a guarantee, so members can go to the bank. Some are guaranteed by the province, and so yeah, it does add a layer of complexity for sure.
Yeah, when that program launched, I thought we're not the only people they didn't consult with, because I had a
Right.
feeling they didn't consult with you either. Because I
Mm.
said this is not going to work super well for a good chunk of nations. But it's interesting to hear the diverse housing ownership models that exist. It's not just community owned or individual owned. There's a whole spectrum there of different models. Hey.
Well, for greener homes, we did work closely with NRCan, and we were working on, one of the issues for that was making sure there were enough energy advisors to meet the demand that program was leading to. But and so we were really at the forefront with working with NRCan to make sure that program would be effective in Indigenous communities. It's changed a bit under the new greener homes or the replacement. So we are trying to work with that agency to make sure that program is impactful as possible.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you have someone's ear there because I'm always worried about for example, in Misquich-Waskahegan, like here in Edmonton, we can use local low interest financing for a rental property. So, for example, if you as I do have a Indigenous family member who's renting from us, we could theoretically, as soon as I get through the paperwork, get solar for that home and other retrofits and whatnot. But can't under the greener homes model because it's not our primary residence. And so it's an interesting barrier that exists federally that doesn't exist as much for renters at the municipal level in Alberta. So anyways, lots of details there that probably nobody in the audience needs to hear about, but Zach has Zach has a broader question. I appreciate it, Zach. Do you anticipate any change in your mandate, funding, and collaboration with the federal government of Canada in light of the U.S. administration's new approach to federal diversity, equity, and inclusion programs? And I would add, in light of the fact that we're heading into an election. So how do you see things maybe shifting for you folks in the coming year? I know everybody's sort of freaking out right now about the geopolitical situation, and I am kind of curious what you think will stick, regardless of changes that might happen in the U.S. or here.
Well, broadly, we've been looking at the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, which, that and EU incentives really pushed the federal government and their incentives for change in Canada. And, tracking the kinds of new factories, new investment in the United States that was linked to the Inflation Reduction Act, they seem to have outpaced Canada quite a bit. For over a year, our question has been, well, how could a change in administration in the U.S. backtrack from that when it's led to so much more employment, so much more economic activity, including in very Republican states. So I think it remains to be seen. I think we all feel a little unsettled in terms of what it's possible to predict, but those have become major economic drivers. They have a geopolitical function in terms of ensuring that there is some investment in the renewables and in green technologies when China has very outwardly tried to outpace Europe and North America in those areas. So we're still hopeful on that front. On the Canadian side, one of the things we're pushing for is the response to the Inflation Reduction Act was the investment tax credit. We were writing letters to the Minister of Finance starting 2 years ago to try to make sure the provisions were clear, particularly for First Nations proponents and investors in clean energy, because many of them are taxed differently and they're taxed more similar to a crown corporation. So the federal government's been working on a separate set of regulations for crown corporations and First Nations. That still hasn't been implemented. So there is some concern about what a change in government could mean for that, but it could also be an opportunity because a bigger fear would be with the regulations for an investment tax credit when it comes to First Nations actually slow down the level of Indigenous participation, which I don't think we would want to see. We really think it's been linked to projects getting to market more quickly by facilitating these kinds of partnerships and making sure they're profitable. Mm-hmm. So that's caused quite a bit of pause in terms of what else will stick. If we do see a change in government, there may be a renewed interest in off-diesel programs and the far north, where I think we see investment in that from the current federal government possibly waning to some extent. And so we are, you know, hopeful that there'll be a renewed interest in that northern investment and communities that are looking at diesel reduction and other energy initiatives. And we're hopeful for, you know, the larger blended financing model for housing, because, you know, we've outlined doing things the way we have been doing is a very expensive way to do business and hasn't seen much success. So, you know, we're hopeful in that area, but also on renewing interest in the off-diesel space.
Yeah, I was chatting with the Prime Minister's office the other day about the tax credits, and they kind of reiterated what you said, which was that the Crown Corp one is basically it's basically dead right now because they don't
Mm,
think it's going to hit the floor with the election coming. So we're just left with the technology, you know, the tax credit for technology, not the clean electricity one. And that's not to say, like you said, it's not like to say the next government may not pick up on some of those ideas. So I am curious to see what happens. I know in Alberta we see conservative governments. However, they are still supportive of low interest financing for clean energy
mhm,
projects. So on that front, I thought, well, even if we have a conservative government federally, hopefully some of the low interest financing options and other sort of mechanisms that are not necessarily rebates, but are other types of incentives, maybe that will still be palatable. So time will
mm,
tell. But I know there is some um, something to be said for watching what happens in Alberta and then guessing what might happen nationwide if we end up with a similar conservative government. That
mm.
said, so much of the electricity landscape is provincial, and as you mentioned,
Yeah.
you folks are working a lot with the provinces. So I think that potentially that will also help ICE and others withstand any change of government if you have such a varied partnership network and you're not wholly relying on one source of funding, it sounds like.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think there are opportunities for us to expand some of the work we're doing. Skills development training is still dispersed in a highly decentralized way, even though there are great opportunities when it comes to access and skills training funding for Indigenous workers. So, you know, there may be some opportunities to work with government to streamline that to some extent, and some of the other areas that will remain federal just based on the federal relationship to
Mhm.
Indigenous communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, that's all the questions we have, but we do have a couple really interesting comments from attendees. So Brent shared that as a nation, his nation participated in the Canada Greener Homes Grant, and it was one single application for all homes in the nation, and they did get funded and had all the homes go through the program. So it was handled by an Indigenous program specific group at Canada Greener Homes. That is really cool, and I wish I knew that a long time ago. So thanks, Brent. Nice to hear that there was a specific sort of program stream for a different housing models. So great to hear. And another note that, of course, I was talking about the high cost of some of these solar integrated products, but yes, thank you for commenting that solar LED lighting is considerably lower cost than others. So not everything that's new and flashy and exciting comes at a higher cost. So I appreciate that comment as well. What I do have here is also an interesting comment that I wanted to pull out from the chat from Rob. Um, let's see here. I'm just going to summarize here. Just as an FYI, so Kenai Blood Tribe are one of two Indigenous transmission line owners in Alberta. Neat to learn. The line was built through their lands to access the transmission line for future projects. And then they faced major obstacles from the AUC and lost many years of income, line revenues due to this. So it sounds like what Rob is saying is that line was built and then they had to almost fight for partial ownership after.
Hmm.
And that is really sad. So he's saying, I hope the environment has changed. And I so hope that too, Rob. Thanks for sharing that story. We might need to get your contact info and learn more about the story of your trials and tribulations when dealing with transmission lines in the AUC, so that we can try and advocate for improvements, because we do frequently advocate to AUC and others. So So thanks for everybody for sharing. And of course, big thanks to you, James. This has been really educational for me and for everybody in attendance. And of course, thank you to Red Deer Polytechnic for sponsoring today's session. Really appreciate the teamwork pulling this all together, and of course, great attendance and great questions all around. So have a wonderful rest of the year, and I'm sure that we will, this is probably just the beginning of many conversations, James, because I'm getting excited thinking about all the ways we might be able to work together in the future. So thanks a lot, and all the best, everyone.